That's pretty cool. Thank you. G'day everyone, Connor McDonald here, just back from Israel. I've been on a trip to Rome and Israel over the last couple of weeks. Just got in the door and I thought I'd record some thoughts about the Israel conference in particular. That was in Tel Aviv, fantastic event, shout out to the crew that ran it. But I thought I'd give you some thoughts on my autonomous keynote there in relationship to my first entrance into Israel. I arrived on a Friday night and the first thing that struck me was how quiet Tel Aviv was. Now, being an ignorant Australian, I was unaware of Shabbat, the day of rest in Judaism. And on the Friday and the Saturday, which were my first full days there, I was, a typical ignorant Aussie. I was actually pretty annoyed. Everything was shut. No shops were open. I couldn't, buy batteries for my presentation clicker. Everything was just really difficult to do. It was hard to get a taxi, and I was a bit annoyed. But the longer the day went, I actually realized what a cool thing this was. Even if you're not a religious person, and I'm not, the thing that blew me away was Shabbat was just this wonderful thing that actually brought people together. Everywhere I went, out on the beach, there were families together. In the parks, there were people having picnics. It was just a fantastic way of, I think, people putting aside all the stresses that they have of their working lives and actually just focusing on the things that are really important. Things like family time, rest, spending time together. So I'd gone from being annoyed because I was focusing just on the negatives for me to actually seeing what an incredibly positive thing Shabbat was in terms of just the culture and the community. That struck me as a metaphor for my autonomous keynote. Now, bear with me. I know it's a stretch mixing autonomous database with Shabbat, and hopefully I'm not offending anyone's religious sensibilities, but for me, it was more of my ignorance in terms of the culture, in the fact that I was focusing on the negatives first before I actually stopped to actually look at what the actual experience was for me, which was overwhelmingly positive. When I first mentioned the autonomous database in my keynote, it's very easy to do the same, to focus just on the negatives. People said to me straight away, "What? No operating system access? Oh, I couldn't possibly use that." Or, "Oh, what? I don't get to play with parameters. Oh, no, impossible to use it. That's critical for me." And a lot of these things focusing on the negatives. But for me, now that I've actually used the autonomous database for a while and actually started to tinker with it and do some experimentation, I was similar. I was a bit cautious, but now for me, the thing is, I'm finding an incredible amount of positives about the experience from a DBA perspective. Someone says to me, "I need a database." Literally, it's a few clicks, and provisioning is about 5 to 10 minutes in my experience so far on the ones I've created. So as opposed to asking for storage from the storage administrator, going to management and getting some approval, going to a few meetings about what the database will be used for, etc. I can literally pick up a one-size, pretty much fits-all database within 5 or 10 minutes and get that to the people requesting it very, very easily. Perhaps the even bigger thing for me is patching. And for me, patching is what I call the zugzwang for DBAs. Now, if you're not familiar with the term zugzwang, many people aren't, it's actually a term from chess. And the phrase comes from when you're in such a bad position in a game of chess, which I often am because I'm terrible at chess, that no matter what move you make, you're actually going to be up in a worse position than before you started. That is known as zugzwang. And for me, patching is zugzwang for DBAs because there's no reward here for a DBA. You have to do patching because, especially with security patches, you know that if you don't, it's just a matter of time before you get hacked. But getting approval to do these patches is a really hard thing to do often in companies because you have this awkward position of going to speak to management and saying, well, I would like to have maybe some downtime or some interruption to service just to apply patches such that we have the exact same service as we had before the patch was applied. There's really no functional benefit often in patching, in particular when it comes to security patches. So getting approval, getting that management backing to do it is really hard. But rest assured, if the patch goes wrong, then it's your head on the line. Or if for example, you don't get to put the patches on. The management say, no, we haven't got time for that. You can't do patching. And guess what? Your system gets hacked. Guess whose head's on the line still? Yours, even though you're the one that wanted to be doing the patching in the first place. That's why I call it zugzwang for DBAs. You're damned if you do and damned if you don't often. Having that taken out of your hands on an autonomous system, I think is a very, very refreshing thing for me as a DBA. It's a bit like Windows updates in that sense of I have some control as to when they're going to be applied, but other than that, the process is no longer my responsibility. I have that guarantee that the security patches will be applied in a regular fashion. And I also have that sort of distance from the process where I can tell my management, this is just part of the fully managed service we signed up for. It's not something I have control over. That for me is a really cool thing as a DBA because I don't have to fret about the security of my system because it's not patched. I remember seeing some figures that last year, something like 80% of all security vulnerabilities were actually on vulnerabilities that had actually fixes available for them. They just hadn't been applied to the systems that actually got penetrated. Now, as I mentioned, control, that might be raise some alarm bells for you thinking, oh, the more control I have, the better it is. But sometimes that little bit of distance and that little less bit of control is actually a positive thing. I can think of a simple example in the Autonomous Database where the users have a password complexity function. And if you try to circumvent that by creating a profile with no complexity function, you're not allowed to. So in that way, you've actually guaranteed to satisfy any audit constraints you've got in terms of password complexity. There's not that sort of risk that just because you have it for some users that you might be, backdooring it or shortcutting it in some way for others. With an autonomous system, because that control is taken out of your hands, that password complexity is guaranteed and immutable. It's definitely going to be there. Don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that a fully managed service is for every single one of your databases. But the reality is, as DBAs, we get called upon to do more and more tasks in our workplace, lots of things to manage. And if I can take 70 or 80% of all the databases that really just are hopefully set and forget for me and not have to worry about patching, not have to worry about security, not have to worry about the day-to-day running of those databases, I still have enough control to manage the applications on them, but I've managed to distance myself from all the sort of boring stuff, and I can focus now my attention on the really mission-critical databases, which might also be autonomous or they might be on site. But from a business perspective, I can focus all my energy on the things that really matter. So hopefully you can see my metaphor of Shabbat and Autonomous Database maybe holds true. I had a fantastic time in Israel, and hopefully I'll get to see the people in Tel Aviv again next year or even beforehand. Bye for now.